They were the unlikely champions, a small, rugged nation clinging precariously to the edge of a continent, constantly battling for survival against giant neighbors. Who would have ever bet on Portugal? A tiny kingdom, smaller than the state of Maine, yet within 2 centuries they didn't just sail the world, they owned the global trade routes, launching an empire that would span 6 continents and last for nearly 600 years. This wasn't just history, this was a desperate, high-stakes gamble against the map itself. We are talking about the true genesis of globalization, the terrifying moment when the world was first stitched together by ambition, blood, and the raw, undeniable hunger for gold and spices. Prepare yourself, because this is the untold saga of how Portugal, against all logic, forged the world's first truly global empire, and why the price of that achievement was paid in centuries of unrelenting, brutal war. Can you believe that the very structure of our modern economy, the way goods flow from east to west, the very concept of a multinational corporation was essentially invented by a few thousand Portuguese sailors and merchants operating out of Lisbon in the late 1400s? It sounds like fiction, a mythical quest, but it was horrifyingly real. Imagine standing on the precipice of the known world, facing the churning, dark Atlantic, the Sea of Darkness, as it was chillingly called. Everyone warned them. The ancient maps ended abruptly. Legends spoke of sea monsters, boiling waters, and the sun turning men's skin black. But the Portuguese, driven by a furious mix of religious zeal and economic desperation, saw not the end of the world, but the beginning of their dynasty. They were trapped geographically and economically, and their only way out was through the terrifying unknown. Their neighbors, Castile and Aragon, focused on the easier, internal fight to expel the Moors. Portugal, having largely completed its Reconquista early, faced a terrifying void. They had secured their land, but now they needed wealth, and the established Mediterranean trade routes were utterly controlled by jealous Italian city-states and powerful Islamic empires. They were shut out, blockaded, impoverished. The silks, the gold dust, the black pepper, the literal engines of European wealth were inaccessible unless they paid exorbitant middleman fees that crippled their economy. This wasn't just about finding a better deal. This was about national survival. Prince Henry, known dramatically as the Navigator, though he rarely sailed himself, he was the mastermind, orchestrated the single most expensive, ambitious, and secretive government project the world had ever seen up to that point. He didn't just fund trips. He built a military-industrial complex dedicated solely to conquering the ocean. He assembled astronomers, cartographers, shipwrights, and mercenaries in a hidden coastal town, pouring the nation's entire treasury into understanding the wind patterns and currents that nobody else dared to master. For decades, they performed painful, incremental nudges down the terrifying coast of West Africa. Every yard was a battle. Every shipwreck was a national tragedy. This was not the smooth, efficient expansion history often portrays. This was attrition warfare against nature itself. They were fighting the deadly doldrums, the relentless headwinds, and the terrifying realization that sailing south made getting home exponentially harder. It was a one-way trip for thousands of men. The early maps looked like butcher paper, blank spaces marked with fear. But every time a captain returned with proof of land, a small bag of gold dust, or a handful of captured slaves, the national fever pitch grew hotter. The ultimate prize, the obsession that drove generations of sailors to their graves, was the legendary source of all wealth, India. To bypass the powerful Ottoman stranglehold on the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, to reach the source of spices directly, was the ultimate power play. It was the equivalent of discovering unlimited free oil today. If they could pull it off, Portugal would instantly become the wealthiest nation on earth. And the stakes were astronomically high. If they failed, the nation would go bankrupt, swallowed whole by Spain. But they kept pushing. They didn't rely on brute force. They relied on radical innovation. They refined the caravel, a ship so revolutionary, so fast and maneuverable, it became the F-16 fighter jet of the 15th century. This tiny ship, guided by mathematical genius and desperate bravery, was their weapon of mass discovery. The pressure was mounting. Decades passed. Generations lived and died, focused on the same goal. Find the tip of Africa. Find the route to the east. And then came the moment of impossible triumph. Bartholomew Diaz, battered and broken by massive storms, finally rounded the southern tip in 1488, naming it the Cape of Storms, a name the king, realizing its true significance, immediately overruled and renamed the Cape of Good Hope. The hope was real. The route was open. But the true, horrifying reality of conquering the East was about to dawn. It wasn't enough to find the way. They had to fight for every inch of that wealth against empires far older, richer, and more powerful than Portugal could ever dream of being. The stage was set for a brutal, epic showdown between a small European kingdom and the ancient powers of Asia. This wasn't merely exploration. This was a hostile takeover of the planet, executed by a nation of fewer than 2 million people. Get ready, because the moment Vasco da Gama steps onto the deck and stares into the terrifying unknown, the history of the world changes forever, and the price of that change will shock you to your core. When Vasco da Gama finally stepped onto the San Gabriel, the wood groaned beneath his boots, a sound that felt less like defiance and more like a final, terrifying warning. This was not a pleasure cruise. This was an act of pure, suicidal desperation, sanctioned by a king whose treasury was running on fumes. A monarch who had staked the entire future of Portugal, the very existence of the crown, on this single, terrifying gamble. If da Gama failed, the House of Aviz would likely collapse, swallowed by the massive debts incurred by a century of relentless preparation and failed attempts. The year was 1497, and every single soul watching from the shores of Restelo knew they were witnessing either the glorious, impossible birth of an empire or the definitive burial of a foolish, bankrupt kingdom. The Atlantic Ocean, stretching out before them, was not merely water. It was the known edge of existence, a swirling, terrifying abyss that swallowed men and ships whole, a realm whispered to be guarded by colossal sea monsters and geographical curses dating back to the dawn of time. It was the Sea of Darkness, and da Gama was sailing directly into its jagged jaws, trusting only in the revolutionary, fragile technology that Portugal had poured its meager resources into perfecting for 50 agonizing years. His ships, though improved iterations of the caravel design, the swift, legendary hybrid vessels, were still laughably small for such an undertaking, merely 4 pinpricks of civilization against an infinite expanse of chaos. They were built for speed and tacking against the brutal, contrary winds, incorporating the Latin triangular sails of the Mediterranean and the square sails of northern Europe, a perfect, deadly fusion of naval engineering never before seen in the world. They carried just enough salted meat and rock-hard biscuits to feed the 170-man crew for maybe 6 months, certainly not enough for the 2-year odyssey that awaited them if the king's desperate prayers were answered. The most crucial tool, however, was not the hull or the sails. It was the astronomical revolution they carried on board, the astrolabe, a bronze disc calibrated to the stars. This device was their lifeline, allowing them to calculate their latitude with unprecedented accuracy, though the nightmare challenge of longitude still haunted every desperate watchman staring into the blackness. They sailed with maps that were mostly blank, relying utterly on the secret charts meticulously compiled by generations of Portuguese mariners who had painstakingly crept down the African coast for decades, paying for every mile with human life and unimaginable suffering. This was not peaceful academic exploration. This was industrial espionage executed by men who believed in God, but trusted the cold, hard calculations of their Jewish and Moorish navigators even more. The first leg of the journey was designed to test the absolute limits of human endurance in naval science. They couldn't simply hug the African coast forever. That route was too long, too risky, and too dependent on unpredictable, agonizing coastal currents. Da Gama had to execute the terrifying, high-stakes maneuver known as the Volta do Mar, the Great Turn, which meant deliberately abandoning the sight of land. He swung his entire fleet sharply westward, deep into the open, empty ocean, embarking on an agonizing 90-day detour into absolute disorienting nothingness, sailing thousands of miles out of sight of any known civilization. This was a psychological masterstroke, yes, but also psychological warfare against his own crew, who feared they were sailing irrevocably off the edge of the supposed flat Earth, driven mad by the endless, monotonous, terrifying horizon. When, by the grace of God and the precision of the astrolabe, they finally spotted the jagged, unforgiving coastline of South Africa, the relief was instantly replaced by sheer, paralyzing terror. They were approaching the legendary Cape of Storms, the notorious geographical bottleneck that had crushed every single European attempt to reach the East before them, claiming lives and fortunes in its icy wake. But they did it. They passed the insurmountable, legendary barrier, and when they finally sailed into the vast, blue, warm waters of the Indian Ocean, a sense of impossible, dizzying triumph washed over the weary men. They had broken the geographical barrier. But they quickly discovered that breaking a geographical barrier was child's play compared to breaking a massive, entrenched financial barrier. They had sailed into a world that was already ancient, sophisticated, and utterly dominated by a network of powerful Muslim trading sultanates stretching from the advanced ports of Kilwa to the diamond markets of Calicut. The Portuguese, arriving in their patched-up, storm-battered ships, expected to find primitive savages they could easily overpower and subjugate. Instead, they found cities like Mozambique and Mombasa, sprawling metropolises far wealthier, better organized, and more architecturally advanced than anything in Lisbon or even Venice. They were not conquistadors arriving to claim an empty world. They were impoverished, desperate intruders arriving late to the most lucrative, established, and jealously guarded trade route in human history. They carried worthless goods, cheap wool cloth, glass beads, and poor-quality trinkets, to a market already saturated with diamonds, silk, and pure gold. Their poverty was nakedly, humiliatingly exposed. This devastating realization that they had survived the perils of the sea only to face an enemy that vastly outnumbered, outtraded, and culturally outmatched them was the true moment of terror for Vasco da Gama. He realized with absolute clarity that if he wanted the spices of the East, he wouldn't be able to buy them with his meager European offerings. He would have to take them by absolute, unrelenting, barbaric force, transforming a desperate trade mission into a horrific war that would span centuries and change the face of global commerce forever. The air was thick, not with the familiar salt spray of the savage Atlantic, but with something far more intoxicating. The scent of cinnamon, cloves, and political dynamite. Da Gama had breached the Sea of Darkness, surviving the Cape of Storms, and now, finally, the San Gabriel and its sister ships were sliding into the waters of the Indian Ocean, a body of water that, for the last 1,000 years, had been the undisputed private domain of Arabs, Persians, Gujaratis, and the mighty city-states of East Africa. This wasn't empty ocean. This was a superhighway of wealth, a dense, interconnected matrix of maritime trade routes stretching from Sofala to Canton. The Portuguese, starved and ragged, were crashing the ultimate global party, and they immediately realized the terrifying scale of the operation they were disrupting. Their little ships, armed with tiny cannons, were about to face civilizations that viewed Europe as a frozen, impoverished backwater. The initial encounters were a dizzying display of navigational prowess and cultural misunderstanding. They skirted the Muslim-controlled coast, finding temporary solace in places like Malindi, a rival city to the powerful Mombasa. In Malindi, Da Gama found the crucial ingredient for success: a pilot, a master mariner whose knowledge of the monsoon winds was literally the key to unlocking the true Spice Coast, a man named Ibn Majid. Imagine the scene. A man who knew the secrets of the seas, written down in meticulous Arabic manuscripts over centuries, now forced or convinced to guide the ragged Europeans straight to the beating heart of India. It was history's most consequential act of industrial espionage, a betrayal of geography that would cost millions of lives. On May 20, 1498, the sails of the Portuguese fleet appeared on the horizon near Calicut, Kozhikode, the nerve center of the Malabar coast. This was it, the end point of the 80-year quest of Prince Henry the Navigator, the culmination of relentless desperation. Calicut was not a fishing village. It was a gleaming metropolis, overflowing with every imaginable luxury, powered by the incredible wealth of pepper and ginger. The local ruler, the Zamarin, Samudiri, sat atop this colossal trade pyramid, commanding armies and fleets whose scale dwarfed anything Lisbon could muster. Da Gama, the proud emissary of King Manuel I of Portugal, was immediately shown the absurdity of his position. He was brought before the Zamarin and asked what gifts he brought from his mighty king, expecting treasures worthy of the global trade system. The gifts Da Gama presented were laughable, pitiful evidence of Europe's poverty: some striped cloth, a few hats, sugar, and jars of honey. Items considered exotic in Lisbon were junk in Calicut. The official who inspected the pathetic offering reportedly burst out laughing, suggesting these were gifts for a pauper, not a king of the Zamarin stature. The Indian merchants, veterans of global trade for millennia, looked at the Portuguese coinage and laughed even harder. Their gold was purer, their ships were larger, their understanding of credit infinitely more advanced. The sheer, brutal reality dawned on da Gama. Portugal had nothing the East wanted, except perhaps iron, but iron alone couldn't fund an empire. The trade negotiations instantly collapsed in a haze of mutual contempt and misunderstanding. Da Gama realized the terrifying truth. If they could not trade their way into the market, they would have to blast their way in. The entire economic model of the Portuguese Empire was forged in that single, crushing moment of profound humiliation. The Zamorin, realizing these peculiar, impoverished foreigners were more aggressive pirates than legitimate traders, began to pressure them, demanding exorbitant duties and even briefly seizing some of the Portuguese crew. This was the existential pivot. The line between exploration and military conquest dissolved entirely. He unleashed a token bombardment on the unsuspecting city of Calicut, the very first European cannon shot fired against a major Asian power, a deafening declaration of war against the established world order. It was a clear, crimson line drawn in the water. It was not a victory. It was a desperate, bloody retreat. Da Gama loaded his meager stores of spices, fled the coast under continuous fire, and began the brutal journey home, his ships now dangerously overloaded with the evidence of his success and failure. The return voyage was an unmitigated disaster, a horrifying testament to the sheer impossibility of their venture. Without the knowledgeable pilot, they struggled against the monsoons, taking 3 harrowing months just to cross the Arabian Sea, dying in slow motion. Scurvy, that invisible killer, ravaged the remaining crew. Men died in agonizing numbers, their gums blackening, their limbs swelling until they were incapable of movement. The fleet that had left Lisbon with 170 men returned with barely 55. One ship had to be deliberately burned off the African coast because there were not enough healthy men left alive to sail it. Vasco da Gama, the man who had torn open the map of the world, arrived back in Lisbon in 1499, not a conqueror surrounded by pomp, but a specter of survival, hauling back just enough pepper and cinnamon to prove that the route existed. The cost was catastrophic, a human toll that defied belief, but the proof was undeniable. The financial returns, despite the losses and the burned ships, were staggering, a profit margin estimated at 60 times the cost of the entire expedition. Portugal now held the key to the global economy, and the rest of Europe was instantly obsolete. The message sent back to King Manuel I was terrifyingly simple, yet absolute. The route is open, Your Majesty, but to hold it, we must trade the crucifix for the cannon and the diplomacy for destruction. The age of the Estado de India, the State of India, was about to explode onto the world stage, soaked in the blood of forced monopoly and oceanic terror. The true seismic shift was not da Gama's discovery of the route, but the monstrous ambition of the man who followed, wielding the king's mandate like a celestial weapon, Afonso de Albuquerque. He was not a traitor, he was an executioner of the old world order, a man whose gaze held the cold, hard geometry of fortress walls and naval choke points, and his arrival was the beginning of the great oceanic reckoning. His strategy was terrifyingly simple, yet utterly unprecedented: control the oceans, control the world, and specifically control every single maritime gate the Indian Ocean possessed. He understood that a tiny kingdom 8,000 miles away could never truly hold a land empire against millions, so the land itself was irrelevant, but the water was everything. He envisioned a chain of impregnable strongholds that would not just trade with Asia, but suffocate it, choking off every competing supply line, specifically the lucrative spice flow that had enriched Cairo and Venice for centuries. This was maritime totalitarianism on a global scale, enforced by the terrifying, unforgiving power of the Portuguese Armada and its bronze cannons. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, which grew impossibly wealthy taxing the ancient spice flow through the Red Sea, suddenly realized their very existence was under siege, not by armies marching on land, but by sails appearing on the horizon, carrying European death and superior firepower. The traditional centers of power were about to be erased. The plan required blood and calculated audacity, starting with the immediate establishment of a permanent, unmovable base. First, Goa. Albuquerque seized the major port in 1510, turning it into the capital and permanent heart of the Estado de India, a place where Portuguese law was absolute and swift. It was a brutal conquest, involving mass executions and the systematic rooting out of Muslim populations to send an irreversible message that resistance was futile and that the Portuguese were here to stay, establishing a physical beachhead of European power that had never been successfully planted before in Asian soil. The capture of Goa was the declaration of permanent war against every competing interest, but even Goa was merely a stepping stone toward the true geographical jewels that would ensure absolute, suffocating control over the global spice trade. He then looked east, his eyes fixed on the Strait of Malacca. This tiny, treacherous bottleneck was the single most important maritime passage in the entire world, the funnel through which all the wealth of the East Indies, the cloves, nutmeg, mace, and sandalwood, had to pass to reach the rest of Asia and ultimately Europe. He knew whoever controlled Malacca controlled the sources of supply. The assault on Malacca in 1511 was a masterpiece of naval warfare and sheer, desperate risk, leveraging the superior sailing technology and the terrifying effectiveness of Portuguese artillery against the wooden defenses of the Sultanate. When Malacca fell, the global economy tidaled violently on its axis. Suddenly, the entire supply chain of the most coveted goods on Earth was controlled by a handful of men operating out of Lisbon. But control meant more than just holding a port. It meant controlling every ship, every sail, and every sailor in the vast, churning waters of the Indian Ocean itself. This is where the Cartaz system was born, the single most insidious tool of Portuguese domination and monopoly. Every merchant ship, whether Indian, Arab, Persian, or Chinese, was now legally required by the Portuguese crown to purchase a license, a passport, to sail the waters that had been free trade zones for millennia. This cartez detailed the exact route the ship could take, the specific cargo it could carry, and most critically, the ports it was strictly forbidden to visit, usually those loyal to their competitors. Refusal to purchase this license, or deviation from its rigid requirements, meant only one thing: destruction. The ship was declared a legitimate prize, an act of war, its crew executed or enslaved, and its cargo seized for the enrichment of the crown. It was piracy, legalized and endorsed by the highest authority in Europe, enforced by the muzzle of the terrifyingly efficient bronze cannon, turning the Indian Ocean into a Portuguese lake. The final masterpiece of Albuquerque's strategy was the seizure of Hormuz in 1515, the narrow, vital entry point to the Persian Gulf, the last major artery connecting the Middle East to Asia. By holding Hormuz, Goa, and Malacca, the Portuguese had effectively placed three massive iron handcuffs on the wrist of global trade. No major oceanic route could bypass their control, and the traditional overland routes, once the lifeblood of Mamluk Egypt and the source of Venetian wealth, withered and died almost overnight. The price of pepper in Lisbon plummeted, while the same pepper in Venice skyrocketed, trapped in a dead supply chain. This economic collapse was not gradual. It was immediate and catastrophic for the old powers. Venice, the glittering queen of the Adriatic, found herself suddenly peripheral, her mighty galleys docking in empty ports, their coffers draining as Lisbon became the undisputed financial center of the known world. The Portuguese, through sheer willpower, technological supremacy, and calculated strategic brutality, had accomplished the impossible. They had built a true maritime monopoly, ensuring that the sun never truly set on the terrifying ambition of the Estado da India, built on water, fortified by fear, and sustained by the terrifying efficiency of the caravel and the cannon. The Mamluks, facing existential doom as their tax base evaporated, desperately tried to contest the seas, organizing fleets of their own, but the highly trained Portuguese armadas consistently decimated them, ensuring that the Red Sea, the gateway to the Mamluk heartland, remained firmly blockaded and the monopoly absolute. The blockade was complete, a financial tourniquet wrapped around the throat of ancient empires. Cairo and Venice, the two pillars of the old spice trade, were now locked in a shared nightmare of dwindling profits and existential dread. The Mamluk Sultan, seeing his treasury collapse, sent desperate envoys, not just to the Ottomans for naval engineering aid, but to the Pope himself, arguing that this Portuguese intrusion was disrupting the Holy Land and demanding Christian intervention against their co-religionists, a truly bizarre plea born of pure desperation. The diplomatic chess game was frantic, yet Albuquerque, the Iron Duke of the East, cared nothing for European politics. His focus was singular and terrifying: permanence. He knew that maintaining a purely naval presence, constantly battling the elements and the attrition of distance, was unsustainable. He needed a capital, a fortress city that could withstand any siege, serve as a shipbuilding hub, and anchor the entire Portuguese presence in Asia. He set his eyes upon Goa, the dazzling, politically fragmented port city on the west coast of India. It was a perfect prize, naturally defensible, possessing excellent harbors, and centrally located to dominate the lucrative trade winds of the Arabian Sea. But taking Goa was not like taking a remote island. It meant seizing a major city-state ruled by the powerful Sultanate of Bijapur. Albuquerque launched his initial attack, a daring, lightning strike in 1510, exploiting local dissatisfaction and surprise. He took the city swiftly, proclaiming it the jewel of the new empire, but this swift victory was a trap. The Sultan of Bijapur immediately amassed a massive army, trapping the small Portuguese garrison inside the city walls as the monsoon season descended, turning the surrounding landscape into an impassable, muddy hellscape. They were starved, besieged, and relentlessly bombarded for months. The Portuguese, masters of the sea but now trapped on land, faced annihilation. It was a test of will unlike any they had faced, a brutal introduction to the scale of Asian power they now dared to challenge. Albuquerque, however, was a tactical genius forged in pure steel. The city fell, and this time, Albuquerque ensured it stayed conquered. He massacred the Muslim garrison but offered the native Christian and Hindu populations protection, establishing Goa as the definitive, permanent operational base of the Estado da India, a piece of Portugal transplanted onto Asian soil, complete with European institutions, churches, and bureaucracy. This was the true pivot point of the 16th century. The empire now had roots. But even Goa was not enough for the Duke's insatiable ambition. He looked further east, to the true source of the most precious spices, the Moluccas, the Spice Islands themselves. To reach them and secure the entire eastern hemisphere of trade, he had to control the ultimate choke point, the Strait of Malacca. Malacca was the Venice of the East, the greatest commercial emporium in all of Asia, where Chinese junks met Indian dhows and Indonesian spice traders exchanged goods with Persian merchants. Whoever controlled Malacca controlled the entire flow of global maritime wealth, a prize far richer than anything Portugal had yet touched. The city was a sprawling, multi-ethnic metropolis, defended by thousands of warriors and massive fortifications, ruled by a powerful sultanate whose influence stretched across the Malay Peninsula. The stakes were impossibly high. Failure here meant not just defeat, but the complete exposure of Portuguese vulnerability on the edge of the known world. In 1511, Albuquerque led a small but terrifyingly disciplined fleet and an army of barely 1,000 Portuguese soldiers, supplemented by a few hundred Indian auxiliaries, against this sprawling colossus. The battle for Malacca was not a simple naval skirmish. It was a desperate, house-to-house urban war fought in the suffocating tropical heat. The Portuguese utilized their technological superiority to devastating effect. Heavy cannons shattered the wooden palisades and stone walls, and the continuous fire of their arquebuses decimated the massed ranks of the Sultan's defenders. But the fighting was brutal, relentless, and demanded every ounce of courage from the invaders. Albuquerque, in a move of audacious brilliance, managed to seize the key bridge spanning the river that divided the city, effectively cutting the defense in two. He used captured vessels and sheer intimidation to force the Sultan into a desperate final stand, which crumbled under the weight of Portuguese firepower and organization. Malacca fell, and the repercussions echoed across the Pacific Rim. Suddenly, the Portuguese had leaped beyond the Mamluks and Persians. They were now staring directly into the immense economic might of Imperial China, a prospect that both exhilarated and terrified Lisbon. With Goa securing the Arabian Sea and Malacca locking down the route to the Spice Islands, the monopoly was no longer just a naval blockade, it was a global infrastructure of control. The price of pepper, cloves, and nutmeg in Lisbon plummeted, even as the royal coffers swelled to unimaginable proportions, turning the impoverished kingdom into the wealthiest state per capita in Europe. This sudden, obscene wealth, however, was also a beacon. The sheer, audacious success of Portugal, achieving what no other nation had dared to dream, now drew the furious, envious gaze of their immediate, titanic neighbor, Spain. The treaty dividing the world was about to be severely tested, and the race for the ultimate prize, the full circumnavigation of the globe, was about to begin, shattering the fragile peace of Tordesillas forever. The world was split in two by a fragile pencil line drawn on a dusty map, but nobody had accounted for the curvature of the earth or the psychological complexity of a betrayed genius seeking revenge. The Portuguese, drunk on the wealth of Malacca and Goa, believed their eastern monopoly was ironclad, defended by the towering cannons of Afonso de Albuquerque's fortresses. This arrogant confidence was about to be annihilated by one of their own, a disgraced captain named Fernão de Magallanes, or, as history would remember him, Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan was Portuguese blood, born of the same desperate ambition that drove Prince Henry, but he felt scorned by King Manuel I, denied the recognition he believed he had earned in the bloody conquest of Morocco and the East. 5 ships left Seville in 1519, embarking on a suicide mission into the uncharted abyss, a journey that would redefine human endurance and map-making forever. The Atlantic swallowed them whole. Mutiny festered like a plague among the Spanish captains who resented their foreign leader, and the icy, howling winds of the southern cone of South America threatened to crush their tiny vessels against sheer cliffs. For weeks, they navigated the treacherous, fog-shrouded maze that would become known as the Strait of Magellan, a horrifying gauntlet of whirlpools and currents where one wrong turn meant immediate oblivion. But he found it. The impossible passage was breached, and Magellan sailed into a vast, terrifyingly calm ocean he named the Pacific, a surface so deceivingly peaceful that it masked the true nightmare that lay ahead. They believed the Spice Islands were just days away, perhaps weeks. They were wrong. The Pacific Ocean was a monstrous void that devoured time and life, stretching for 10,000 agonizing miles that no European ship had ever traversed. Scurvy turned the sailors' gums black and their joints brittle. They ate sawdust, rats, and leather softened by their own urine just to survive the empty horizon. Starvation reduced proud men to weeping shells, watching their comrades drop dead onto the bleached decks, staring into an endless horizon that offered no relief, only the blinding cruelty of the sun. When they finally staggered onto the islands of the Philippines 3 years later, the crew was a skeletal fragment of the robust force that had left Spain. Yet, one ship, the Victoria, commanded by Juan Sebastian Elcano, somehow limped into the Moluccas, the legendary Spice Islands themselves, laden with enough cloves and nutmeg to make the voyage, despite all the loss, financially successful. But the moment that Spanish flag was raised on Tidor, the Treaty of Tordesillas was ripped to shreds. This was Portugal's territory. The line, drawn 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, extended around the globe, and Portugal knew exactly where the Spice Islands lay, squarely in their half of the world. The Portuguese viceroys in India and Malacca were incandescent with fury, viewing Magellan's surviving crew not as explorers, but as pirates and trespassers who had stolen the ultimate prize. The war for the Moluccas, the true heart of global commerce, was now on. It was a war fought on the other side of the planet, thousands of miles from Lisbon and Madrid, waged by small fleets and desperate garrisons, primarily centered around the 2 rival island fortresses, the Portuguese on Ternate and the Spanish on Tidora. The Portuguese response was swift and brutal, driven by the realization that if Spain held the Moluccas, their entire Asian enterprise would collapse. They mobilized their forces, leveraging their established networks and alliances built since the days of Albuquerque, launching immediate raids and sieges against the Spanish invaders. For the next decade, the islands became a distant, grinding chessboard of tropical warfare, a bitter, humid campaign where disease was often a deadlier enemy than the opposing muskets. The Portuguese had the advantage of proximity and established supply lines stretching back to Goa, while the Spanish were isolated and starved of continuous resupply across the vast hostile Pacific. The cost, however, was astronomical, draining the royal treasuries of both nations in a distant, fever-ridden jungle fight that neither side could afford to lose. King João III of Portugal realized that a military solution was too costly and too slow, threatening to destabilize the entire, delicate Indian Ocean trade network. He decided to leverage the one thing his predecessor had mastered: diplomacy, backed by overwhelming naval power, transforming the conflict from a bloody war into a cold, hard financial calculation. In 1529, a decade after Magellan first set sail, the conflict was settled not by cannon fire, but by coin. Spain, desperate for cash to fund its European wars and realizing the supply route across the Pacific was commercially impossible at the time, agreed to sell its theoretical rights to the Moluccas. The Treaty of Zaragoza was signed, establishing a definitive anti-meridian, a second line dividing the globe in the east. But the psychological damage was done. The world was proven round, the vastness of the planet confirmed, and Portugal's brief moment of unchallenged supremacy was already showing fatal cracks that stretched all the way back to Lisbon. The empire was built on water and spice, but it was about to face its greatest challenge, not from Spain or the English, but from the terrifying internal rot of religious extremism that demanded purification and conquest, known universally as the Inquisition. The golden age of discoveries, the unimaginable wealth pouring into Lisbon, was being paid for not just in spices and silks, but in a currency of fear and fire. King João III, the Pious, inherited a throne drenched in the glory of Vasco da Gama, yet burdened by a spiritual paranoia that demanded total uniformity, a purity impossible in a globalized trading hub. The Inquisition, formally established in 1536 after years of terrifying pressure, wasn't just a religious tribunal. It was the state weaponizing faith to seize assets, eliminate political rivals, and enforce an impossible ideological purity on a nation built by global trade and tolerance. The public spectacles of the auto da fe, the terrifying act of faith, became a common and horrifying sight in the squares of Lisbon, Évora, and Coimbra, burning not just heretics, but the very economic stability that kept the empire afloat. This was a self-inflicted wound of catastrophic proportions. The forced conversion and subsequent persecution of the Cristãos Novos, new Christians, descendants of Sephardic Jews who had often financed the initial voyages, resulted in a massive brain drain. Vital capital, essential banking expertise, cartographic knowledge, and intellectual strength, the very engine of the Portuguese machine, were driven straight into the waiting arms of emerging rivals like the Protestant Dutch and the shrewd English, gifting them the competitive edge needed to challenge Portugal's monopoly. While Lisbon was consuming itself internally with theological terror, outside the walls, the empire continued its terrifying, unstoppable expansion. This was the precise moment Portugal perfected its chokehold on the global spice trade, turning the massive Indian Ocean into a private Portuguese lake, fiercely enforced by a relentless string of fortified feitorias and powerful naval patrols. To manage this impossible, stretched-out dominion, a new force arrived, sharper and more disciplined than any army: the Society of Jesus. Ignatius of Loyola's black-robed warriors, the Jesuits, were not merely missionaries seeking souls. They were diplomats, master educators, spies, and the cultural shock troops stabilizing the empire's furthest, most volatile reaches. Their mission was simple, but terrifyingly ambitious: to anchor the sprawling, chaotic maritime empire in the unshakable certainty of Catholic faith, converting rulers and subjects alike to ensure loyalty to the Portuguese crown. Their most luminous and most zealous star was Francis Xavier, the Apostle of the Indies, whose tireless zeal took the Portuguese flag and the Catholic cross from the established colonial capital of Goa across the archipelagos of Southeast Asia, all the way to the remote, sophisticated, and utterly alien shores of Japan. This incredible journey, reaching the ultimate frontier of the known world and establishing trade links, often trading European weaponry for the right to proselytize, was a feat of spiritual audacity that redefined the very limits of Portugal's global reach. The Estado da India, governed from the fortified city of Goa, was now an unimaginable logistical and military machine. Every year, the legendary Carrera da India, the India Run, saw massive, slow-moving, heavily armed carracks loaded with pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and the priceless cloves, making the perilous journey back to Europe. This wasn't simple trade. It was a ruthless, monopolistic operation, generating the kind of royal revenue that made every other European monarch green with desperate, covetous rage. The crown had leveraged its strategic genius to control the two defining choke points of Eastern trade, the narrow Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf and the vital, teeming port of Malacca in Southeast Asia. By holding these crucial nodes, the Portuguese ensured that virtually every single ounce of spice and every yard of silk entering the European market first passed through their hands, allowing tiny Portugal to punch far above its weight for decades and fuel extravagant spending on palaces, armies, and the massive administrative machine required to manage such a staggering collection of global territories. Yet, this enormous, terrifying success carried the silent, corrosive seeds of its own destruction. The logistical chain was impossibly long, vulnerable to massive storms, endemic tropical diseases that decimated garrisons, and the constant, gnawing threat of increasingly organized European competitors who were tired of paying Lisbon's exorbitant prices for essential commodities. The French privateers, operating under thinly veiled letters of marque, began to stalk the Atlantic routes like hungry wolves, chipping away relentlessly at the wealth that kept the crown solvent. Then came the English sea dogs, swaggering and emboldened by Queen Elizabeth I, treating the richly laden Portuguese convoys as nothing more than easy prey, a form of state-sanctioned piracy that Portugal simply lacked the naval depth to fully counter or prevent. But the deepest, most lethal cut was demographic. Portugal, with a domestic population barely scraping past 1 million inhabitants, was desperately bleeding manpower with every passing fleet. The demand for sailors, soldiers, administrators, priests, and colonists in Goa, Brazil, Angola, and Macau meant that the nation was constantly exporting its young men, thinning out the domestic workforce and creating a catastrophic deficit of bodies back home. They had conquered the world, yes, but in doing so, they had begun the slow, painful process of hollowing out the very heart of their own kingdom. The sheer, terrifying impossibility of ruling an empire that stretched across 3 oceans with so few people was finally beginning to manifest as a true existential crisis. The glory of Juan III's reign was nothing more than a glittering facade built on borrowed time, shimmering with Asian gold while the foundations of the homeland quietly cracked under the strain. The stage was now set for the ultimate, dramatic collapse, a sudden, shocking end to the greatest maritime empire the world had yet known, sparked by a tragic, reckless royal decision that would rewrite the map of Europe forever. The golden age of Shuao III had passed, leaving behind a kingdom bloated with the wealth of the East, yet dangerously vulnerable at its core. All the spices, the silks, the impossible profits flowing back from Goa, Malacca, and Brazil now rested precariously upon the shoulders of one man, a boy king named Sebastian, the last hope of the illustrious Avis dynasty. He was not like his shrewd grandfather, who had balanced the ledger and played the long game against the unforgiving sea. Sebastian was a vision haunted by the ghosts of crusaders past, raised in a cloistered, intense religious environment that magnified every whisper of chivalric duty into a thunderous command from heaven itself. The weight of Portugal's impossible history, the memory of the centuries-long war against the Moors, the ancient glory of Alcácer do Sal was imprinted upon his very soul, leading him toward a dramatic and fatal misinterpretation of his imperial mandate. Sebastian saw the vast, integrated maritime empire not as a commercial entity to be maintained through careful diplomacy and naval supremacy, but as a massive, gold-plated sword to be wielded against the infidel, a weapon to finish a war that had been dormant for decades. His zealous eyes turned south, away from the profitable chaos of the Indian Ocean, back to the brutal, unforgiving sands of Morocco, a place where Portuguese blood had been shed for centuries without lasting colonial or commercial gain, yet which held an almost mythical allure for the young king. All the wise men, the experienced governors, the pragmatic financiers who knew the brutal reality of North African warfare and the immense cost of maintaining Asian trade routes, pleaded with him. "The empire is in the east, Majesty. Our profit is in the oceans, in the trade routes connecting Lisbon to Macau, not the desert." But Sebastian heard only the call of destiny, the whisper that he was chosen to lead the final, glorious crusade, perhaps even finding the mythical Christian king Prester John, or establishing a new, invincible kingdom of God in the arid lands. He was obsessed with the idea of a personal, earth-shattering military victory that would define his reign, rather than the tedious reality of managing global commerce. The opportunity arose disguised as a dynastic squabble within the Saudian Sultanate, a perfect trap laid by fate and desperation. An ousted sultan, Muhammad al-Mutawakkil, begged for Portuguese aid to regain his throne from his formidable uncle, offering Sebastian the ideal justification for intervention, a holy war conveniently wrapped in a political agreement that promised territory and glory. This was not a minor skirmish. The reigning sultan, Abu Marwan Abdelmalek, however, was no weakling. He was a brilliant military strategist, educated in Ottoman military tactics, consolidating power fiercely and ready to face the naive European intruder head-on with a unified and motivated army. The preparations for this grand, reckless venture were monstrous, draining the state treasury, pulling seasoned soldiers away from the critical, vulnerable garrisons in India and Brazil, stripping the kingdom bare of its best fighting men and most experienced commanders. Portugal was mortgaging its future, sacrificing its global reach for a localized, highly symbolic desert conflict. Sebastian insisted on leading the force himself, ignoring every desperate warning about the fragility of the Avis line. He was the last true heir, risking the fate of the entire royal house and the nation itself on a single, desperate gamble in the blistering heat of the Maghreb. 20,000 men, an army built on the foundations of global trade, packed onto hundreds of ships. It was the largest foreign expedition ever launched by Portugal, a testament to the nation's wealth, but also its growing hubris and catastrophic lack of strategic focus. The most seasoned captains and nobles, recognizing the suicidal nature of the mission, attempted to dissuade him, some even faking illness to avoid sailing, but Sebastian saw their prudence as cowardice and plunged ahead with blinding confidence. In the late summer of 1578, the fleet sailed from Lisbon, a glittering, terrifying spectacle of gold, steel, and blind, unwavering faith. The city watched from the harbor, gripped by a terrible mixture of pride and profound dread, knowing instinctively that this was not merely a battle for territory, but a wager on the very existence of Portugal as an independent power. Sebastian, dressed in the ceremonial armor of a true crusader, ignored the ill omens, the whispers of betrayal, and the desperate tears of his most loyal, pragmatic advisors. He was marching directly toward his self-created destiny, convinced of absolute divine protection despite the overwhelming odds and the strategic folly of the move. The destination was Ksar el-Kebir, or as the Portuguese renamed it, Alcácer Quibir. It would not be a glorious triumph, a new jewel in the crown. It would be the stage for a massacre, the precise moment when the seemingly immortal Portuguese Empire would receive a fatal, self-inflicted wound that would leave it bleeding out for decades. The king was not just leading an army of men across the Straits of Gibraltar. He was steering the entire history of his nation, the accumulated efforts of 200 years of impossible discovery and trade, directly into an inferno that would silence the Avis dynasty forever and invite the cold, calculating intervention of their greatest rival. The inferno was not a slow burn of political decay. It was a sudden, blinding flash ignited by the reckless ambition of a single, doomed monarch. King Sebastian I, the young, intensely religious, and desperately militaristic heir, believed his destiny lay not in maintaining the vast spice network his ancestors had bled for, but in a holy crusade in North Africa. He saw himself as the chosen spiritual warrior, the final piece in a divine plan to dismantle the Muslim power structures that had haunted the Iberian Peninsula for centuries, an impossible dream built on a foundation of dangerous arrogance. The army he assembled was the largest Portugal had mustered in generations, but it was dangerously thin on professional soldiers, padded instead with zealous volunteers, foreign mercenaries, and the flower of Portuguese nobility who felt obliged to follow their king into glory or oblivion, draining the nation of its essential military backbone. They sailed straight into the trap of the Moroccan forces led by the brilliant tactician Abd al-Malik I, a man who understood the desert's merciless capacity to swallow invading armies whole, turning the heat and the sand into instruments of mass destruction. On August 4, 1578, near the town later renamed Alcácer Quibir, Ksar el-Kebir, the clash began, rapidly devolving from a heroic charge into an impossible rout under the brutal sun that sapped the strength and sanity from the heavily armored European troops. The Portuguese lines crumbled, their noble cavalry trapped by the unforgiving terrain, their infantry decimated by relentless Moroccan cannon fire and perfectly executed flanking maneuvers that turned the open field into a slaughterhouse. Sebastian, reportedly fighting with a furious, almost suicidal bravery befitting his messianic complex, vanished utterly amidst the chaos and the carnage, swallowed by the heat and the dust of his own making. His body was never definitively recovered, giving rise immediately to the agonizing, desperate myth of Sebastianism, the fervent, heartbroken belief that the beloved lost king would one day return on a foggy morning to rescue Portugal from its darkest hour of humiliation and despair. This myth was a desperate psychological bandage over the gaping, existential wound of political reality, a denial of the horrific truth that the empire now lacked a legitimate heir. With Sebastian gone, the direct line of succession snapped like a frayed rope under extreme tension, plunging the nation into constitutional terror and inviting the immediate attention of every predatory European power. The only available heir was Cardinal Henry, Sebastian's great-uncle, a man already in his late 60s, physically frail, and bound by his holy vows never to produce an heir, rendering him incapable of securing the future. He was the most unlikely candidate imaginable to govern a global maritime empire built on testosterone, iron, and the relentless pursuit of profit, a frail clerical hand trying to steady a massive listing galleon. He reigned for only 2 agonizing years, a transitional ghost king whose every shallow breath was measured by the vultures gathering on the horizon, sharpening their beaks for the inevitable feast that awaited them when the old man finally expired. The primary, most powerful, and certainly the hungriest vulture was Philip II of Spain, the king of the most dominant empire on earth, who watched from Madrid with cold, calculating patience, his legal teams already drafting the documents of annexation. Philip II had legitimate, though distant, claims to the Portuguese throne, stemming from his mother Isabella, the daughter of the late King Manuel I, the very king who had ushered in the golden age of discovery. Crucially, he didn't just have a legal claim. He had the armies, the inexhaustible gold from the Americas, and the diplomatic network necessary to enforce it with overwhelming force and total impunity. The Spanish claim was presented not as an invasion, but as a legal inheritance, a necessary unification to stabilize the shaky Portuguese crown and protect its vulnerable overseas assets from French or English encroachment, a narrative designed for international consumption. While the Cardinal King Henry struggled to manage the chaos and convene a Cortes parliament that could somehow designate a native successor, Philip was actively preparing the military hammer he knew would eventually be required to shatter Portuguese resistance, mobilizing troops on the border. The choice was quickly narrowing: internal collapse or annexation by the colossal Spanish machine, both paths leading to the extinguishing of Portuguese sovereignty. 2 main factions fought desperately against the Spanish tide: the nationalists who sought a Portuguese-born king, regardless of legitimacy, and those pragmatic nobles who saw the writing on the wall and sought favorable terms for surrender to avoid ruinous war. The most prominent national candidate was the Prior of Crotto, Dom Antonio, an illegitimate but spirited claimant who gained massive popular support among the common people and the fiercely independent merchants who feared Spanish control over their trade routes. Don Antonio was the embodiment of the Portuguese fighting spirit, a passionate refusal to yield the impossible empire to a larger rival. But he lacked the institutional backing, the military training, and critically, the necessary gold reserves to oppose the Habsburg juggernaut that could finance perpetual warfare. He had popular zeal, but Philip II had cannons. When Cardinal Henry finally died in January 1580, the legal window slammed shut with the sound of a guillotine blade, and Philip II gave the cold, decisive order to move immediately. He dispatched the feared Duke of Alba, a man whose reputation for ruthless military efficiency preceded him like a dark shadow, to lead the invasion force that would settle the matter swiftly and brutally. The Duke of Alba, having crushed rebellion in the Netherlands with brutal finality, was the perfect instrument for a quick, decisive occupation, ensuring minimal disruption to Spanish interests. The Spanish military columns marched toward Lisbon, finding only scattered, poorly organized resistance, the true military strength of Portugal having been annihilated 2 years prior in the deserts of North Africa. Dom Antonio was defeated swiftly at the Battle of Alcántara, sealing the fate of the mainland and silencing the last cries for native independence. The legendary independent Kingdom of Portugal, the tiny engine that had powered the Age of Discovery, was swallowed whole. The year 1580 marked the beginning of the Iberian Union, a 60-year period that Portuguese historians would later bitterly refer to as the Babylonian captivity, a time when the sun of their own independence was eclipsed by the might of Madrid. Portugal retained its identity, its currency, and crucially, its vast colonial empire, but its foreign policy, its military strength, and the ultimate authority over the entire global system now belonged to Philip II, King of Spain and, reluctantly, King of Portugal. The tiny nation that had defied geography and conventional power structures for 2 centuries was now merely a province, albeit a very wealthy one, of the monstrous Habsburg machine, a magnificent jewel set temporarily into Spain's crown. The immense energy dedicated to finding new routes, establishing trade posts, and bypassing the old world systems was now absorbed into the grand, overwhelming imperial agenda of Madrid, shifting the entire balance of global power. The price of one young king's folly was the loss of national sovereignty for 3 generations, and the epic saga of Portuguese independence was abruptly paused by the sheer force of Spanish military might.